Welcome to the Football Autobiography Show. I'm your host, Josh Schneider-Weiler, and it is such a pleasure to be with you all today. As many of you know, in this podcast, we have people in the football industry, like players, coaches, agents, writers, and more, reflect on their careers. Today, our guest is Dave Thomas. Thomas is the author of at least 17 books and counting on his beloved Burnley FC, including an autobiography with Paul Fletcher, who was a previous guest on this podcast a couple weeks ago. He has also written for the website Up the Clarets and Something to Write Home About magazine. Thomas is a masterful storyteller, and he is part historian, part diehard fan, part author. So in this episode, he regales you with tales of watching Burnley in the 50s, meeting fans in Tasmania and beyond, and the bond that is formed from a mutual love of the same club. Also, he talks about Burnley away trips, the future of fanzine culture in the UK, and how he went from being a school headmaster to retiree and one of the biggest Burnley football writers there ever has been or will be. So he's an absolute thrill to listen to, a masterful storyteller, and it's like just having a conversation or listening to your old man, your father tell stories of football from 40, 50, 60 years ago. So, without further ado, enjoy my episode with Dave Thomas. All right, I'm here in the most beautiful conservatory in the world, perhaps, with author Dave Thomas. Dave, how you doing today?
Oh, very well, very well. We're okay today. It's been a busy day, but it's great to see you.
So, Dave, before we start talking about being an author, I want to talk to you about what does it mean to be a Burnley fan? What is your first memory watching Burnley Football Club or football in general?
My first of Burnley is my first football memory because I'm going back to the middle 50s because I'm a lot older than I look. I keep telling myself that. And it goes back to the middle 50s, and I was probably about 10 or 11 years old, and my father was a really keen Burnley Football Club supporter, and he took me along a rite of passage. You take your son to his first football match, and I think it was either 55 or 56, and I was bored sick. I'd be about 10 years old, and it was Burnley v Man United, which I was quite excited about. But Man United came out in blue, and I couldn't figure this out. I'm thinking, why are they playing in blue? I had no idea about changing strips and changing colours, and it didn't put me off football. But I thought, this is not for me. I was bored and cold, and then it resurrected itself. The interest resurrected itself when you go to school. You're with your pals. Some of them were keen Burnley fans, and I thought I'll tag along again. And maybe this was 3 years later, maybe. And we went specifically to watch Burnley's goalkeeper, Colin MacDonald, highly rated, brilliant keeper. And at the other end was the Bolton Wanderers keeper, Eddie Hopkinson. And both of them were vying for the England football first spot goalkeeper. And that's why we went, to watch both goalkeepers. And from that day, I just carried on going. And then 59-60, season 59-60, was the championship season with Jimmy McIlroy, Jimmy Adamson, a lot of great players, Ray Pointer, John Kennelly. People of that era can still name the whole team from back to front. And that was it. Then I was hooked. And the first ever game of that season was a baking hot day. And we got the train. And it's 1959, August, I guess. And it was at Leeds United. Baking hot day. We went to Leeds United, me and a pal, just the two of us, and we got to the Leeds City Station, walked all the way to Elland Road, saw Burnley win 3-2, but the funny thing was, what we thought was a last-minute equaliser by Jack Charlton, and we came home thinking the score was 3-3. Now in those days, no mobile phones, no Sky, no texts. We thought the score was 3-3. The next day we discover goal disallowed, the game had finished, so it was Burnley had won 3-2. And that was the first game of that particular season. They go on to win the title, and I'm hooked ever since. So for several years, went with my father, well, for 3 or 4 years, with my father every game, and then I went to college in '66. That kind of put it on hold for 3 years. Although Harriet, my wife, during those 3 years we'd go to occasional games, and she became hooked as well. So, hooked from 1959, August, when Burnley won 3-2 at Leeds United.
And so as you got more hooked on Burnley, how did that manifest itself? Going to more games, anything else, or?
Well, going to the games and keeping a scrapbook. And I wish I had that scrapbook of that first season. Because, I mean, even now, I keep scrapbooks, cuttings. I'm a hoarder. I keep everything. Programmes, cuttings, clippings, books. I mean, I've got rooms full of stuff. But that first ever scrapbook I kept of the 59-60 season, I threw it away. And I can't believe what I did. When I went to college in 63, I think it was, big clear out, get rid of a whole load of stuff, and out went that scrapbook. And I just wish I had that scrapbook today still, 50 years later, or more than 50 years later. So it also manifested itself in that I learnt to read because my father made me read the football report in the Sunday Express every Sunday morning to him. And if we were visiting relations on a Sunday in the car, he'd have me read. I'd be in the back seat, he's in the front, he'd buy the Sunday Express, and I'm in the back of the car reading the report to him. So I attribute my success as a great reader to reading Burnley Football Club reports.
You were doing your own little radio telecast from the back seat.
Absolutely, with only 2 listeners.
And so I'm curious, as someone who didn't grow up in that time, what was the reporting like in the 60s on these matches, and how is it different from today?
Much more detail than it is today. You've got great football reporters today like Henry Winter, who was the best of the best, really. Back then, it was more complex reporting, more detailed reporting, longer reports maybe, unless you get something like the Times or the Telegraph, where today they're good, long, detailed reports. But you buy a report today in, for example, the Mirror or the Sun, short words, little sentences, short attention spans, tabloid writing, whereas back in the 50s, more explicit, more detailed, more graphic, more lyrical, more poetic. Just better writing.
Yeah, they had to really take you to
well,
the
that's
stadium.
it, because you couldn't see things on the TV immediately afterwards. So a match day report in a Sunday newspaper was the only way that a lot of people knew what was going on in a game.
Yeah, and so can you describe also along the same lines how going to the game was perhaps different back in those days in the 60s and 70s as to the experience you get now and when you go to Burnley?
Well, I'm not sure it's that much different in as much the spirit of the thing doesn't change. You're still going to. I mean, Paul Fletcher, who you've interviewed, he remembers going to watch Bolton Wanderers back in the 50s, and the football ground was like the church, and people would funnel down the streets towards the game, towards the ground. That still goes on. Perhaps the difference is more people now go by car. Far fewer buses. But back in the 50s, 60s, there were dozens of special buses would go from all the outlying towns, and each bus carried 50 or 60 people. That's finished. That's gone. People now mostly go by car, and you're all fighting for a car park space. I mean, I think the big difference is when I went in my father's car in 59-60, we parked right next door to the ground. Empty spaces down all the little side streets and the rows of terraced houses. Whereas now, you're parking a mile away to get a parking space. That's maybe the difference.
What makes going to a game? I've never been to Turf Moor. What makes that ground different than other grounds in the Premier League or just in England in
Well,
general?
today it's still got a very old feel about it because there are still two stands there that date back. One dates back to the 60s, one to the 70s. Even the two newest stands go back to the 90s. So I'm not saying it's a little ramshackle ground, it's not. But it's got this homely, cosy, small feel to it. It's very intense. You're very close to the play. Whereas you go now to a purpose-built stadium, whether it's Doncaster or whether it's Swansea, we call them Lego stadiums. We call them identikit stadiums. You could be anywhere, unless you're at the Emirates, which seats 60,000, or you're going to be at Tottenham, which will have 70,000, and this huge, great stand the building behind the goal, which will be different, really different, fantastic atmosphere, I'm sure. But Burnley is a very old-fashioned ground. It's an old-fashioned ground in a 21st century business, if you like, and it benefits from that. As far I'm told that players of away teams hate coming to Turf Moor. They don't like the dressing rooms. They don't like how close the fans are. Every word of abuse is audible. So it's just a lovely old-fashioned with an old-fashioned feel to it.
It sounds really nice to attend a game there. I'm gonna have to go there at some point.
You'll have to do that. Yeah.
When you were younger and you were reading your dad these reports, did you ever dream or imagine one day you would be writing books about Burnley?
Absolutely not. Absolutely never. The writing bug didn't start until we had a daughter who, in her early days, would never go to sleep unless one of us was sitting outside the bedroom. Not in the bedroom, just outside the door. And when it was my turn, I thought, what can I do? I'm sitting there for half an hour. I thought, I'll keep a diary. So I started writing diaries, just personal diaries. This must be 30 years ago. Became a teacher. And I worked in a little village school in South Leeds, which was a fund of incredibly funny stories about the people and the staff. And I thought, one day when I finish doing this job, I'll write stories, a novel maybe, or a series of books about being the headmaster of a little village school. Well, that fell through. I got one written, but nobody was interested back then. We're going back 20 years maybe. But I rang a publisher in Manchester, who I didn't know at the time was a football specialist, to float the idea of this series of books about being a headmaster in this daft little village in South Leeds. And I spoke and rambled on for ages until he said, but I only do football books. At which point I felt quite disappointed, deflated, but somehow we got talking about the diaries I kept, and at this point I was keeping a Burnley diary. And it was the time of Stan Ternent, and there was a particular season with scores of 6-2, 6-5, 7-4, where we lost, didn't win. It was a crazy season, and I'd kept a diary. And the minute I said that to him, "Oh, I'll publish that," he said. "I'll publish it." Well, he had no idea who I was. And I said, I think, "But you don't know who I am." He said, "Well, you're a headmaster, so therefore you can write. And Burnley books sell," which they don't, not in a great quantity. "I'll do it." So I thought, right, great. Instead of writing hilarious novels about being a headmaster in a crazy little school, my first football book got off the ground. And I sent the draft to him, which really was the uncorrected diaries. And of course, a diary is a personal thing. You're writing all sorts of stuff, personal opinions, judgments about people, stories about people. And he said, "I can't publish this, it's libelous." But he said, "I'll clean it up, we'll tone it down, we'll work on it." And that became It's Burnley, Not Barcelona, which is a Stan Ternent expression when he used to say, the club had no money, of course, and he would say, "Oh, we're Burnley, not Barcelona," when there was a defeat. And that's how the first book came about. And the other story about that book is, within 6 months, the publisher had gone bankrupt. He'd gone out of business. So I always say my very first book put my publisher out of business. So that's the story of It's Burnley, Not Barcelona.
And now you're working on I think it's 17 since? So 18 total? Right?
It's 17 or 18, I'm not sure. The next one, it goes off to the publisher by the end of this month, or by the end of September. And it's a continuation of the No Nay Never books that I did. And there are 2 of those, Volume 1, Volume 2, and they are anthologies of good Burnley writing. And the nice thing is that nobody's ever said no when I've asked, can I use a chapter from a book? And there's so many books with Burnley content, either one chapter, and you take that chapter out and you put it into an anthology. And the postcard I've kept since the very first book anthology that I did, which must be 2004, came from Hunter Davies. Now, Hunter Davies is one of the great sports writers, and his book, I think it was called The Glory Years, a book about Tottenham Hotspur.
Yeah.
And I thought he'd written about a guy called Ralph Coates in that particular book, and I wanted to include that chapter in my anthology. So I wrote to Hunter Davies, explained the situation, not in it for profit, retired headmaster, writing for fun, doing an anthology, can I use your Ralph Coates chapter? He sent me the most inspirational postcard, which I've still got.
And do you mind saying the essence of what he said in it? Or
The essence is, good luck with your writing, keep at it. Because I'd said this is only my second book, and we're talking about 15, 14 years ago maybe. And I thought, wow, this is Hunter Davies writing a postcard to me saying, yeah, go for it, good luck, Dave. And I've still got it. And that was a key moment, was that. And since then, nobody's ever said no. I mean, occasionally, what a publisher might want a bit of money, and if it's worth it, I might pay something for a piece to write. If they want too much, I don't use it, because I don't make enough to be paying big sums of money for me to justify using somebody's work from their book. But that's how those books are constructed. And you'd be amazed how many people write about Burnley Football Club. Not as a whole book, but as a chapter in a book. The perfect example, a book called 32 Programmes, where a guy was emigrating to the US with a massive collection of programmes, and his wife said, you're not taking all those. You can pick 32 programmes, enough to fit in the suitcase along with your clothes. That's all. So he picked 32 programmes of games that meant a lot to him, and 2 involved Burnley. So there are 2 chapters in that book, 32 programmes, about Burnley, based on those 2 programmes that he bought. So they're going in the next one I'm doing.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So after that second book, you get this inspirational note by Hunter Davies, and is it at that point that you know, like, this is the next chapter of my life?
Well, yeah, it's a funny feeling. You do one book, and that first, I'm not being critical, but for some people that might be their ambition fulfilled. I've written a book, great, next project. But for me, it made me want to write another one and another one. And the thing is with Burnley Football Club, there's so much history, so much tradition. There's no shortage of material, whether you're going right back to the FA Cup win of 1914 or the first championship win of 1921, I think it was. Or you've got a great player like Tommy Lawton comes to Burnley in the late 30s. And he didn't stay very long, but he went on to have a fantastic career. Everton, Arsenal. So there's so much goes on at Burnley. So many ups, so many downs, promotions, relegations. So many skeletons in cupboards, shall we say. Which you're careful to write about, which you are. Because you don't want to upset the apple cart.
So do you consider yourself a historian at this point?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because I can write a book, and within 6 months I've forgotten what's in it. Mainly because I'm on to the next one. It's bizarre, really. You spend 9 months to a year on one book, and it consumes you. And my wife will tell you this. I'm sitting in the office. I'm up at 6 in the morning sometimes, a couple of hours work, a bit more in the daytime. And all you want to do is another one. And even now, I'm not sure if it's book 18 or 19. I really don't know. I'm thinking, what shall I do next? So the next one is planned after this one, which will be for next year. And again, I've got a publisher lined up, which is a book about away days. And it's how wherever we are, no matter what we're doing, for example, 2 weeks ago, I'm on a boat coming down the Douro in Portugal, and it's the opening day of the season, and Burnley are at Chelsea. And all I want to know, I'm on a boat down the Douro, gorgeous countryside, you're in wine country, you're in cathedral country, monastery country, beautiful journey, but it's the day of the game, and all I want to know is, how are Burnley doing? So there were 10 of us in the party, so we all got on the top deck of the boat, we tuned in on my wife's iPhone, and we followed the game, and we're going down this lovely journey down the Douro. And before we know it, Burnley have scored 1-0, we're astonished. 2-0, we're absolutely gobsmacked. 3-0, before half time, and we're sitting there laughing, this is crazy. Burnley winning 3-0 at Chelsea, and here we are in this bizarre situation, we're sailing down the Douro in Portugal. So this book is all about how we do these kinds of things. And it will be called Adventures in Watford and Other Tales. And it's called Adventures in Watford because getting into Watford on the town centre one-way system is okay. Getting out of it is a different matter. And we've had real adventures in Watford trying to fathom out how to get out of Watford. So that'll be, I think, in time for Christmas 2018. So we're in Tasmania listening to a game. We're in Florida tuning into games. New York. We were in New York when Burnley finally were relegated in 2010 from the Premiership. And I'm sitting in a bar in central New York, an Irish bar, watching on TV, and I'm in New York watching Burnley at home to Liverpool, and I'm thinking, this is bizarre. I'm in New York watching this game. On the other screen there's an Arsenal supporter watching Arsenal. So it's all about occasions like this.
And so when you meet other fans in Tasmania, in New York, Florida, all around the world, what is that moment like when you find out that they're a Burnley fan as well? And
well, the Tasmania trip was interesting because we were in Australia, and we went to Tasmania for 2 or 3 days from Sydney to actually meet up with Burnley fans that we knew were there. But the one in North Tasmania, I had no idea that he used to work for a guy called Bob Lord. Now, Bob Lord was the old Burnley chairman, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then he died in 81, and he had a butcher's business. Now, Terry, the guy in Tasmania, we got to their house, journey from south to north, driving all day, evening meal, and we're chatting away. And I'm talking about the book I was doing just then, a book about Jimmy Adamson. And Jimmy Adamson and Bob Lord eventually had a fairly difficult relationship. And Terry pipes up, I used to work for Bob Lord. Well, I nearly fell off the chair. Because at that point, I'm writing the Jimmy Adamson book, and I need information about Bob Lord. So when Terry begins to tell me what it was like to work for Bob Lord, Monday was pig day, pork day, Tuesday was beef day, Wednesday was lamb day in his meat warehouse, in his meat factory. I got some great notes, some great information out of nothing, totally by surprise, in Tasmania, from a guy who used to work for him.
And when you write your work, obviously there are Burnley fans all over the world. I mean, do these Burnley fans reach out to you and tell you about your books? Or?
Well, they do. I've got a good customer he lives in the WD Ranch, or the 4W Ranch in Driftwood, Texas, of all places. And he's a customer, There's an invitation to go and visit him whenever we want, but we haven't done. The guy in Seattle, there's people in New York. So, and there's emails flying backwards and forwards all the time. And some of them buy my books, so I'm parceling books up and sending them off. So it's great. There's contacts all around the world. It's just fun. And the question was, what does it mean? What does it mean to know all these people around the world?
Yeah,
it's global. It's bizarre. Because the question was, did I ever think I would get to be writing Burnley football clubs and their books? And the answer is no, never. And the greatest player of all time at Burnley, Jimmy McIlroy, did a book about Jimmy. Well, two, in fact. One's a great big scrapbook. The other is a really glossy biography. And he came to stay here a couple of times. Now, he was a legend. My father's hero. I watched him play. We're talking about 1960, 61, 62. Now, if you'd said to me then, or I'd said to my father, one day I'll write a book about Jimmy McIlroy, and Jimmy will stand in my house in his pyjamas with a mug of tea, chatting away. Well, as we say in Lancashire, I'll go to the foot of our stairs. Have you heard that?
No, I haven't.
Well, that's an old saying. Well, I'll go to the foot of our stairs.
When
you're really surprised.
Wow.
So there he was in his pyjamas.
And so when you're actually in that moment with Jimmy, or when he first walks in the door, what are you feeling? And
I'm thinking this is surreal. This is Jimmy McIlroy. I think we've gone back about maybe 8 or 9 years now, when he was still reasonably, well, he still is physically very fit, but so back then he was still a handsome bloke and a really smashing fella. And as we do in the book, in a place just outside of Burnley, a local printer cum publisher, we'd got all the pictures and photographs, we'd scan them into the computers. He would come and join us at the printer, at the design studio, shall we call it that, in the design studio. And we'd sit there, me, Roy the designer, Jimmy the player, and very quietly, before we knew it, there's 8 to 9 people standing behind us, listening, hanging on his every word, because this is Jimmy McIlroy. And he's still in Burnley, still revered, and he's now the club president. I think he's 85, 86, still goes to games, but I haven't seen him for quite a while now.
Is there anyone else that when you met, they just blew you away?
Not. Yes, for this reason, a guy called Dave Thomas, another guy called Dave Thomas, and the story there is he used to live down near my sister-in-law's, and I knew he worked in a school in Chichester as a PE sports master, but my sister-in-law never cottoned on as to who it was. So we'd often go and stay with that sister-in-law in Midhurst, and Dave lived near Chichester. So I fixed up to go and visit him one day. And of course, when he opened the door, I'm thinking, what a player he was. What a fantastic player he was. And the funny thing was, my wife then took the dog off to give it a walk down by the seafront. When she came back and knocked on the door, and Dave answered the door, and he said, I'm sure I've met you before. Well, she's not quite identical to her sister, but almost. And Harriet said, well, you probably know my sister. What, he said. So it broke the ice. And it was a funny, odd, bizarre moment. So he knew my wife's sister, Jenny, because he also did a bit of physics teaching as well, or maybe chemistry. He did something in the labs, and she was a lab technician. So they actually worked together once or twice. And he said straight away, you look like somebody I work with, called Jenny Collier. And she said, well, that's my sister. So that was a bizarre moment. But that was a great afternoon, sitting talking to Dave. Since then he's moved back up to his roots up in the north. Well, he's from Nottingham, but he spent the majority of his life up in the northeast, and he's moved back up there.
So out of all of your books that you've done, of the 18 or so, which one did you enjoy most writing?
It's a hell of a hard question to answer, because everyone is different. I'm proud of the fact that every book is different. They don't follow a format. They don't follow a formula. So I've done diaries, anthologies, autobiographies, biographies. And it's the one I've just written that I always say gives me the most satisfaction. So the one I've just done about Roy Oldfield, the old groundsman, that's really satisfying because Roy's in his 80s with a pin-sharp memory. And the nice thing about that was we did the interviews week after week after week in his little bungalow. And we always got somebody to come along as well to sit with us, either ex-players, ex-managers, people he knew. And we had these cosy chats in front of his little fire, a few sandwiches, cup of tea, and it was lovely doing it. And also doing the Jimmy Mack books was fantastic. Sitting in that design studio, just listening to him talking about each photograph as it came on screen. And the other two books I always mention are the Paul Fletcher book called Magical and the Roger Eli book called Thanks for the Memories, because they're so different. You've met Paul Fletcher. He's bouncy, bright, gay. Gay as in happy, of course.
Yeah. No, just boundless energy.
He's a blue sky guy.
Yeah.
Every day is magical in Paul's life, and that's why we called it Magical. And the book reflects that. And so I chose a writing style to reflect that, which is bouncy and pithy and full of little jokes and one-liners, because it's got to reflect Paul. Roger, on the other hand, who was now a very successful businessman, had a career beset by injuries, bad luck, and managers who, one in particular, Roger's career illustrates how you can be at the mercy of a manager's whims. And he had one glorious season, that's all he had, one glorious season at Burnley. When they got promotion, 91-92, he was player of the year, scored goal of the year, but the rest of it was just hard work for him, really was. Endless hardships, endless obstacles, if you like. And he's a very serious guy. He's a smashing guy. And he has got a sense of humour. But he wanted this book to be serious. He wanted it to be a book really about the pitfalls of being a pro footballer. That it's not all flash cars and jewellery and bling and wearing those ridiculous headphones. It can be a very, very hard life in the lower divisions. And so I always say, get both, but get one of each. Read them both. Because one is bouncy, one is very serious. And as one review put, almost a textbook in what it's like to be a struggling footballer. And so I get great pleasure from that as well. And I'm getting great pleasure from now about starting the writing of the Away Days book, Adventures in Watford, because my diaries go back donkey's years. So I'm writing about places I've been to way back in the early 2000s with the supporters club, weekend visits, and I'm going through my old diaries and it brings back all sorts of memories, long forgotten memories of people you've met, places you've been. And diaries are great for settling arguments as well. So there's the pleasure of writing it and the pleasure of going through all your old diaries. I've got rooms full of stuff.
And reliving it.
And reliving it. Yeah. And I'll rush in the kitchen and I'll say, Harry, did you know that? Do you remember that? And I'll quote something from years back. So then we'll chew it all over and have a chat about it. It's great.
So if you could relive either one day or one decade, or maybe even there was a decade even before, before you started watching Burnley, what would it be?
It's not a decade. It's the time from 72, and I know this. We always say this, and it's for personal reasons as well as football reasons. And we're looking at the time from 72, 73, 74, 75, and it's the time of Paul Fletcher's team, Jimmy Adamson managing, players like Leighton James, Colin Waldron, and it was a magical time to be a Burnley Football Club supporter because they got promotion in 72, 73 from what was then Division 2 back to Division 1. And Adamson called it it was going to be the team of the 70s, he said. And it was a wonderful team of great players, fantastic football. It was a pleasure to go every Saturday, a real pleasure. personally, in career, I'd just become a deputy headmaster. We were as yet unburdened by children, so every weekend was great. We pleased ourselves, out for meals, out with friends. It was a wonderful time. So that's the time I always look back at very, very fondly. Of course, the 60s, when you're a kid at school, they're great times, aren't they? No cares, no worries. Until you're in the sixth form and it's time to knuckle down and pass your exams. But until you get to the upper sixth, life had no cares in the 60s. 63 to 66 at college was great. I don't think I realised I was going to be a teacher until the very last day when it was exam time. And I went in the exam room and I suddenly realised, oh my God, I'm going to be a teacher. Because I went to that college for just to have 3 enjoyable years, which I did. I met my wife. There were 3 great years. Played hockey back then. Hockey.
Wow.
I was a star. And I'll tell you this, it's a rough little game, is hockey. It's a sneaky game.
Wait, we're talking ice hockey or
hockey? Oh,
or
not
field hockey.
Field hockey, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sneaky game.
I'm curious, you've at this point devoted your last 15, 20 years, and really your whole life to Burnley, but specifically since you retired as a headmaster to Burnley. Do you ever get tired of it or need a break from it?
Well, funnily enough, there was a time, I think it was shortly after the 2 Jimmy McIlroy books I did. I'd done 2 books in 1 year, and it was draining. And I did feel tired. I thought, I need a break from this. And I think I spent almost a full year not working on any book. And I forget what the next book was. Was it the Paul Fletcher or the Roger Eli? I can't remember. But it took a bit of getting back into. But once I'd picked up the pen again, as it were, no looking back. The thing is, it's a pastime that keeps you active, and it keeps your brain working. And going over to Burnley once a week, either to visit somebody, meet somebody, talk to somebody. It's a little break in your week. It's a focus of your week, and I enjoy that. At the moment, I'm not doing a weekly visit because the books I'm doing don't require it. But there will be one after the away days book that will. And I'm not going to say what that book is yet, but it's a major Burnley figure. Well, it's a major football figure. And that will require a lot of visits, a lot of research. And that's going to be a shared book. Myself and another guy called Mike Smith are going to work on that.
I'll definitely look forward to it. When you've been writing for Up the Clarets, a Burnley blog for quite a while, doing a weekly column, so to speak. A lot of these fan, for lack of a better word, like fanzines or like fan blogs are, for nearly every team in England exist. Do you see that genre kind of changing as time goes on, as it has already changed from 20 years ago when that didn't really fully exist?
Well, I think they're becoming more sophisticated. Obviously, websites didn't exist 20 years ago, but fanzines did. And I've got a whole hold-all full of old ancient Burnley fanzines in the basement, and they're crude, they're rough, they're rude, they're abusive. I think those days are behind us. I write for one called Something to Write Home About, which is the fanzine of the London Clarets. And it's produced 6 times a year, and it's scholarly, it's studious, some really, really good writing in it. And there are hundreds of them. I think there's 250 in the complete collection. And if you've got that complete collection, you have a complete history of Burnley Football Club. So, and a site like Up the Clarets, it's a terrific site, excellent site. It's informative. The writing is good. There's Tony Scholes, who writes the great match reports, which are very fair, non-abusive, impartial almost. And I think people now take great care not to be abusive. as per Twitter, as per Facebook, because a lawsuit is only a phone call away. I think that's the big difference. People are careful now what they write and what they say, especially Blackpool supporters, because 2 or 3 of their guys were writing some near-the-knuckle stuff about the state their club was in. I think the chairman took them to court and they paid a lot of damages. So, more sophisticated, more academic almost. The London Clarets magazine, I would say, is academic. And the one I write for, the weekly thing I did for Up the Clarets, that goes back 7-8 years. And Tony does really good match reports. And I thought, well, it's no good me doing just a match report. Otherwise, I'm just duplicating what Tony does. So I always try to make them delve into history a wee bit. So there's history, bit of travel, their food articles as well. So they're as much about me as about Burnley, about me and my travels and holidays and experiences. But I found that last year I just couldn't keep it up. Churning those out week by week by week became very, very hard to keep them fresh when you're trying to do food and travel and the history of the club as well. So I'm doing some, but not as many.
If someone wanted to do something similar to what you do, write books exclusively about their club, not necessarily just Burnley, but if someone was a Norwich fan and they wanted to write books exclusively about Norwich, what would you tell them to consider before they wanted to pursue that endeavor? And what skills would they need to do it?
It's a bit like being asked how long is a piece of string, because I get a few emails saying, Dave, where do I start? What do I do? And all I can say is, it's like a blank page. It's the old blank page syndrome, writing a novel, isn't it? Where do you start? Daft as it sounds, you just say, well, start writing. Just write something, anything. That's how I started with the very first diaries I ever wrote. And they were crude, and they weren't very sophisticated, but they got better and better and better. So you've got to start and reread it, go through it, go over it, and then, of course, try and find a publisher, which is not easy. I was lucky, and I found this guy in Manchester who just said, I'll do it, off the cuff. How lucky is that? And I never looked back. Or you find an agent, which is equally difficult. I think every supporter perhaps thinks they can write something, but it's just getting started, getting pen to paper, and it's overcoming that mental block of the very first blank page. I mean, I don't think there are any golden tips or guidelines or rules. You'll either do it without being told how to do it, or you won't do it. And I think if you've got to ring somebody up or email and say, how do I start, Dave? You're maybe not going to make it, because if you do want to write, you'll do it anyway. But do what I do. Keep a diary, and see where it goes.
Who are 3 people you would love to share a meal with, have a dinner with? Alive or dead?
Oh God, Bob Lord for sure. Bob Lord, the old Burnley chairman. Chairman from 55, I think it was 55 to 81. He built the club into what it was, the tremendous club that it was until 75 maybe, and then it began to go down the pan. And it went down the pan for 30 years. So Bob Lord for sure. A controversial figure. The players loved him because he was generous. People he worked for in his meat factory probably didn't. He was president of the Football League. He was on all sorts of committees. He knew football inside out. He made that club what it was. And it's a book I'd like to do. So Bob Lord, of course. Now, funnily enough, a guy that nobody's probably ever heard of outside of Burnley, a guy called Jimmy Holland. Now, Jimmy Holland was the old physiotherapist at Burnley in the 70s, much of the 80s. Now, when players are injured and they're on the table and they're working with the physio, they tell that physio all sorts of things. And the physio knows all the secrets that are going on. He knows the skeletons in the cupboards. I'd love to talk to Jimmy Holland. He's died now, of course, Jimmy Holland. And the third one, I think I'd be struggling because there are so many. There's a guy called Doc Ivan.
What a name.
Right now, well, he was a doctor. Doc Ivan was a Russian emigre. He fled from Russia with his family shortly after World War One, came to England, studied, became a doctor. How he finished up in Burnley, I have no idea. But he became the club doctor, club director, club president, but I never met him. And he's died, of course. Now, he knew all the secrets. He knew every secret. I mean, his time at Burnley goes back a long, long time, as long as Bob Lord, I think. So they're the three, because they know the secrets of Burnley Football Club. Not that you could write about all these skeletons, because that's a little rule of mine. I'm careful what I write. I always say to myself, if I'm interviewing somebody and I'm writing about that person, I want to feel welcome back in that person's house. So I'm not going to write anything scurrilous or gossip. But there are things I'd like to know what really happened.
Yeah, just for yourself.
And they're the three guys who would know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Is there anything, any request you have of the audience for the people listening?
Buy my books. Right. The website is www.burnleyfcbooks.co.uk or .com. I can never remember which one it is. I think it's .co.uk.
I'll put it on my website in the show notes. And is there any way else fans can connect with you?
Home email is beehivethomas@aol.com. But the book website is a good one to use. Yeah. There's a separate email address on there as well.
Yeah.
The sad thing is that Burnley books don't sell by the thousand. They really don't. It's a rare Burnley book that I think sells more than 3,000. And one of the problems is you never really find out how many you've sold from a publisher. I'm not saying that publishers keep secrets or try to bamboozle you. But it seems to be a very imprecise business in that one in particular, naming no names, to this day I've no idea how many books that guy sold or how much money he still owes me.
Well, you can just imagine and say you're like a best-selling, it sold 1 million copies. And
yeah, I'd like to be my wife is always saying, for God's sake, write a blockbuster. And the frustrating thing is, I know enough about certain footballers to write what we would call a bonk buster. Yeah, bonk buster.
Yeah.
You understand? Yeah. A really lusty football book.
Yeah.
There are certain footballers that I know and I've met at Burnley who've got a tale or two, and I know those stories.
Yeah.
But I could never write about them.
It's not worth selling the soul.
Well, it isn't. It isn't. I'd be drummed out of Burnley.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute treat.
My pleasure. I'm just thinking, gosh, that's gone ever so quickly.
I know. Time flies.
We've been sitting here talking for 9 hours.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to it on iTunes, Stitcher, Podcast Addict, Acast, or any podcasting catching app. Want to learn more about the guests and go behind the scenes? Then go to my website, www.footballautobiography.com, and subscribe to my newsletter. Also, if you like the show, or even if you hated it, leave a comment on either my Twitter page @footballautobio or my Facebook page, The Football Autobiography Show. I welcome and would appreciate any feedback from you all. Thanks for listening. Take care.